there, good afternoon. I'm Tracy Bates, the Chief Curator for the Department of the Interior's Museum. It's a pleasure to welcome you here to this latest installment in our public lecture series. As many of you know, these presentations tend to encompass a very wide range of topics that reflect the diverse workings of our bureaus and the Department of the Interior as a whole, past and present. And today's program is a deep dive, pun intended, on the science being done by two of our bureaus, BOEM and USGS, in the Gulf of Mexico, on the intersection of sea turtle behavior with the work of our marine minerals program. Before we get started, I did want to point out to you that you all have on your seats a feedback form, and we encourage you to fill those out and deposit them in the tray as you exit at the conclusion of the lecture. And in terms of programs coming up, on Tuesday, June 18th, the Bureau of Land Management's senior paleontologist, Scott Foss, will be here for a discussion on how paleontological resources are managed and our strategic management tool that's being used in the field nationally and with our international partners, and that's called the Paleo Map. But turning our attention to today's presenters, Dr. Kristen Hart is here all the way from Florida. I guess we're sort of rivaling temperatures down there these days, yeah? Where she's a research ecologist with USGS's Wetland and Aquatic Research Center. In her 2 decades with USGS, she's worked in several protected areas and national parks, specifically focusing on population ecology of rare, threatened, and endangered species, and even some invasive species. She's had lead roles in the research of sea turtles, alligators, crocodiles, terrapins, and Burmese pythons. Doug Piatkowski joins us from BOEM, where he's been a physical scientist within their marine minerals program since 2013. And in this role, he applies his background in biology and marine biology and his former work with the Army Corps of Engineers to provide policy guidance, direction, and supervision for environmental assessment and consultation activities related to leasing decisions on the Outer Continental Shelf. Please give me a hand in welcoming Kristen and Doug.
Well, thank you everybody for the opportunity to be here. I think I was going to do introductions, but I think we pretty much did it right there. And on this opening slide, I guess what I'd first like to start with is emphasizing the collaboration between two agencies within DOI to achieve good science. So essentially, and in my role at BOEM, identifying what the clear data gaps are to inform our decision making, and then collaborating with USGS scientists, specifically Kristen and her team, to do the research to inform those data gaps. So I think this is what my goal is today, is to share some of the work we're doing, including Kristen's work, but really put it in the context of this collaborative atmosphere and how we're working together between the two agencies to inform the decisions that we have to make. So the way this talk is going to be structured today is I'm going to go over what the key risk factors are as it relates to sea turtles and the program that we are involved in at BOEM. Some of the tools that we've developed, right on the bottom of this figure here, titled ASTER, Analyzing Sea Turtle Entrainment Risk. So as I go through kind of the risk discussion, I'm going to transition into a tool that we've developed to help us manage that risk on our projects. In order for that tool to become more and more robust over time, it's going to require more detailed data on sea turtle behavior, distribution, and how that relates to our projects. And so on that third tier there is where I'll transition for Kristen to provide some of the work that she's been doing for us. And ultimately, the way this will work is as identify risk, talk about the tool that we've developed, a decision support tool to manage that, the data that we're collecting in the field to then help us better manage that risk again, and again, that data will make our tools more robust. So they're all feeding each other. Before I begin, let me just kind of really briefly introduce BOEM's Marine Minerals Program. I don't want to get into the details just for the sake of time, because we have done 2 separate library series discussions on the program in general, and at the top of this slide, I made note of the titles of those 2 separate presentations, which you can look back on to give you a little more detailed background on the Marine Minerals Program specifically. But in general, I'd like to frame it in these kind of 5 programmatic building blocks. So BOEM, specifically the Marine Minerals Program, we're tasked with managing kind of the exploration and ultimate development of offshore non-energy marine mineral resources. And so for the sake of today's talk, specifically, we're involved in executing leases and negotiating agreements for the use of sand that is in federal waters that may be used for coastal restoration projects. So as a part of that kind of leasing function, we also do the environmental coordination and compliance documentation. And so as we're working through those different requirements, whether it be the National Environmental Policy Act or Endangered Species Act, that is where this link of better understanding the risk and impacts to sea turtles, and then identifying the science that we have to do to potentially reduce the risk. So again, it's that leasing building block. So we're executing leases for use of sand to build projects on the beach, and we work with the Army Corps of Engineers in just about all of our projects, where they are the lead on the construction side. And then, so the second building block here is sand resource evaluation. So as a part of our program, we're also proactively working to develop a national sand inventory, essentially putting out where these resources may be offshore, so that in advance of an actual project need, we can kind of be strategic in how to manage the use of that resource. So as stewards of this resource, we have to know where it is to manage it. And that leads me to kind of this third title here, stewardship. We're involved heavily in kind of use conflict. And so if we kind of put together this national sand inventory and map out where the resources are proactively, we can also set the stage for managing use conflict, whether it be oil and gas pipeline infrastructure in the Gulf, renewable energy transmission lines, or other fishery use in the Atlantic. Knowing where that sand is, we can kind of proactively manage these different uses of it. And then specifically as it relates to sea turtles and the context of today's talk, we can kind of utilize the current research that's out there on what the distribution and behavior patterns are of these animals, how that may overlap with a high valued resource. And so that in advance of somebody coming to use that sand, we can kind of be strategic in how we can remove that resource while still reducing the risk to sea turtles. And so the two bottom blocks here that I've highlighted are environmental studies and collaboration. So what I'm going to talk about today, and part of Kristen's talk, is specifically BOEM's environmental studies program and the funding that we've used to execute work that helps us fill data gaps that we've identified and help us make more informed decisions. And then that collaboration piece. You know, we're a small program, and a lot of what we do is leveraging off of other agency expertise and partnerships and collaboration. This slide here is essentially kind of a dredging 101. So I mentioned earlier that the Marine Minerals Program negotiates use of these sand resources for these coastal restoration projects. One of the primary equipment types for extracting that resource is a hopper dredge. There's a couple other dredging techniques, but because of the location and the distance offshore, you've got the wave climate, the currents, as well as that long transport distance when you're removing sand from the Outer Continental Shelf. That pretty much puts most of the dredging work in the realm of a hopper dredge. And so that upper left-hand picture there is an example of a hopper dredge that's owned by Great Lakes Dredge and Dock. The name of this dredge is Liberty Island. This dredge holds, on average, about a 6,000 cubic yard capacity. To give you some context, your everyday dump truck that you see can handle about 10 to 14 cubic yards. So one load on this dredge is just shy of 6,000 cubic yards. So that gives you kind of a sense of the scale. The picture on the upper right hand there, beginning with kind of the numbers at the bottom, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Number one, these are mobile vessels. So on the port and starboard side of the dredge is what they call a drag arm. It's essentially like a moving set of vacuums. So this dredge is designed to be mobile, and as it moves across the surface, these drag arms are skimming about a 2 foot or so cut of sand off the surface. And so as that sand is removed off the surface, a series of centrifugal pumps kind of pull it through the pipes. And then as you see in the bottom left-hand photo, that material shoots into what they call the hopper. And it comes in through a series of different ports, inflow ports, and each dredge is configured differently. But that material comes in as kind of a water sand slurry, and then as it's agitated in that hopper, it kind of decants off the finer sediment and the water, and then the coarser sediment settles out until it reaches what they call a productive load. Once it's reached kind of a maximum load, they can actually mobilize that dredge as many miles as they need to, or as economically feasible, to a place where they can then hydraulically offload it. So on these big beach projects that you may have witnessed, they'll dredge it from miles offshore, they'll mobilize the dredge to the beach placement location, they'll connect to a series of pipes as identified in number 5 there on the upper right-hand side, they'll re-agitate the material, and they'll pump that slurry to the beach where it'll help ultimately build the beach or restore a coastline. What I really wanted to emphasize in this upper right-hand photo is, again, this drag head. There's one located on the port and the starboard side. This interaction right here is the context of our discussion today. That's where the risk of impacts to sea turtles occurs. Not really in the water column. There's a series of requirements where they're not allowed to actually turn those pumps on when the drag head is in the water column. They're only allowed to turn them on the bottom. And so that's the area of interaction with sea turtles that we're talking about. This bottom right-hand photo here is a picture of me underneath one of these drag heads. This is a drag head that was on a dredge that's about a 3,600 yard capacity. To give you kind of context on how big these drag arms can be, or these drag heads can be, the biggest dredge that was recently constructed has a capacity of 15,000 cubic yards, so just shy of 5 times bigger. And so, again, the drag arm or drag head size grows with the size of the dredge. This is a picture here post dredging operations. This gives you a picture of what the bathymetry looks like after a project's over, and kind of what the post-project condition looks like. And as you can see, it kind of has run these parallel stripes across what we call a borrow area. So that box was a defined area that they were authorized to extract sediment from, and this gives you a sense of what it looks like after they've removed the sediment. The important piece I wanted to mention is, as I discussed in the previous slide, these animals, the risk is right at that benthic interface where that drag arm is extracting that superficial layer of sediment. I described it kind of like vacuums underwater. So now imagine yourself running that vacuum across your living room floor where you've just got a flat carpet that you're vacuuming in your house, and compare that to potentially having to vacuum your steps. And so the reason I provide that context is because you can imagine if that benthic interface of where the dredge is interacting with the sand is where that risk to sea turtles is, the bouncier that environment is, the more challenging it is for that drag head to stay on the bottom. And so you can see in this post-dredge picture, if this dredge were to come back and dredge more out of this area and it has those kind of bumpy contours, it could potentially be a higher risk environment, and the inability to keep that drag head hard on the bottom could potentially lead to a greater risk of sea turtle entrainment. So I provided this photo here just to kind of give you a sense of both what the operation looks like and then what the bottom contours look like after a project's done. So getting back to this identification of risk. So I talked earlier about how the Army Corps of Engineers is a partner on all of our projects, and they're ultimately the agency executing the construction, and we're more managing the sand resource that they're using. The Corps dates back, and the Corps is in charge of maintaining navigation of federal channels. So their interaction with sea turtles and the risk of entrainment dates back to the 80s and early 90s. So the history of risk and the development of mitigation and investment in research is primarily done, has primarily been done by the Corps. Since BOEM's Marine Minerals Program started in the mid-90s and dredging in the OCS has continued to increase, we have seen lethal entrainment of animals on our projects. And so what we've been doing at BOEM is continuing to execute some of the critical mitigation measures that the Army Corps developed dating back to kind of the early 90s. Some of those mitigation measures include what I have here in this middle figure, which is what we call a deflector. They designed and invested a significant amount of money researching a way to modify the engineering components of a dredge to mitigate this risk. And what it is essentially two I-beams that are welded together, and they're put in the front. This image on the left is a drag head without a deflector, and then you can imagine the deflector in the front of it almost functioning like a plow. And the concept is that when you couple the deflector with specific operating parameters where the dredge tender is required to make sure that his angle of approach when he's putting that drag head on the bottom is one in which it forces the deflector to push sand and plow almost a wave of sand ahead of the drag head, so that if an animal is in front of it, it kind of gets disturbed and moved out of the way and avoids this suction field around the drag head. And so this mitigation alone, once implemented back in the 90s, really helped reduce the entrainment of sea turtles on a lot of these projects. An additional mitigation is this, on the right-hand side is a modified shrimp trawler, where we use these techniques to kind of, in advance of the dredging operation, trawl essentially turtles that are in the water column and physically relocate them out of a project area. There's pros and cons of this technique, but it's another measure that we implement to try to mitigate that risk of the operation. So even though these measures have been in place for years, and they have significantly helped reduce the risk, we haven't reached a zero risk realm, and we may never, but one thing that BOEM has invested in on top of the history of the Army Corps' research to mitigate this risk is coming up with methods to really figure out what is that unique project level component, what are the specific risks associated with individual projects as it relates to our understanding of sea turtle behavior and our understanding of dredging operation, and how do we better understand those project level risks and manage them proactively. So one of our studies that we got funding at BOEM for through the Environmental Studies program is to develop this decision support tool that we call ASTER. ASTER is the Analyzing Sea Turtle Entrainment Risk tool, and we use this in our program to try to proactively manage risk before a lease request comes on. And then even during construction, it's a tool that we can use. If we have encounters with sea turtles, we can use this tool to help us analyze why things are happening and perhaps implement different techniques in the future to reduce that risk. And so this figure here shows you kind of the scope of all of the red dots represent individual leases that we've executed, and the yellow boundary is kind of the range in which dredge feasibility using a hopper occurs. And so you can see throughout the Gulf and into the Atlantic, there's a pretty wide range of our project locations, and this is the expansive distance of the distribution of sea turtles throughout the Atlantic. And so each project has different species present, different behavior patterns present, and until recently, we haven't really considered all those localized factors in whether a project is more or less risky of entrainment, or has a higher or lower risk of entrainment. Some of the objectives of ASTER were to develop a temporal and spatial relationship of sea turtle behavior, specifically develop the borrow area design so that we can recognize the operational constraints and connect them to sea turtle behavior and potentially develop new mitigation tools. So this graphic here on the left shows you, it's actually from one of Kristen's publications that shows you the distribution of sea turtles, and there's a high abundance right in one of our project locations. Yet in that specific project, we actually didn't have any entrainments in some of the past actions, and we started asking the question, what are sea turtles doing in this area that is unique, that they're not presenting themselves to be at risk of the dredging operation? And so we're trying to better understand the behavior, the specific operational components of a dredge and how efficient that dredge works in that area. And then between that sea turtle behavior, their time spent at the bottom, and then the activities of the dredge, try to better understand what that risk is. We worked collaboratively with dredging industry as well as a whole suite of sea turtle experts throughout the country to try to figure out what the key data variables were that we needed to consider in developing this tool that could help us make these decisions. This was one of the first times that somebody has literally sat down at a workshop with industry representatives and really pulled information from them as to what the key issues are that they've experienced over the last 20 plus years that has led to either a less or more efficient type of operation. And we learned a lot working with industry, as well as the sea turtle community. I'm going to quickly go through just a few screen grabs of the different components of this tool. On the top of the slide, you'll see a link. This is we have a publication that's on our SBIS database, and anybody can go back to this link if they want to pull the publication. But we needed to develop a decision support tool that was really simple to use, that folks, whether you're in the Gulf of Mexico or in the Atlantic, everybody has a standard way of how they're analyzing this level of risk. This is the opening screen that there's a total of 21 data variables that we gathered from kind of priority data variables that we learned from industry representatives and from the sea turtle community that we built into this tool. And at that first interface, a user has the ability to select all the different data sets. And one of the critical data sets that's ingested into this tool is from OBIS, which is a kind of a repository for folks throughout the world, essentially, that can deposit their data. And in this particular case, we're pulling sea turtle telemetry data from this database. And so a user can actually, in our Aster tool, click a button and show all the different turtle distribution data sets that may have occurred in that area. I should also emphasize on the right of these slides are all the partners that were involved. So this was an interagency agreement study between BOEM and NOAA, and we also partnered with the Army Corps of Engineers given their expertise and interest in this type of tool. And our contractor was Quantum Spatial, and they leveraged expertise from Duke's Marine Geospatial Ecology Lab. And so it was a great team of folks who helped develop this. This slide here is kind of the first step of the tool where a user can zoom in to their area of interest. In this particular example, this is off of the Outer Banks of North Carolina. Those areas highlighted are specific sand resource areas. One of those areas in particular was identified as a site to be dredged. And so a user can box in the area of their interest, and then in that area, all the data variables of those 21 that have data in that site, they all pop up on this screen here, and the user can select which ones they're interested in, whether it be sea surface temperature, sea turtle distribution data, a history of entrainment or take that may have occurred in that area. All that data is now visible, and then they can select the different risk categories that they want for each of those variables. This next step is kind of a histogram of all those risk categories. The user can select an absolute risk that will then take them to step 3, and this is kind of the graphic that shows what the risk is for each of these different blocks based on the variables that you've selected. The really cool piece is kind of this step 4, which is a report out. So for all of the different components, all the variables that were selected, all the text that was written in, the logic supporting why a user selected certain variables and why they selected certain risk ranges, is summarized into a PDF report that spits out. So for somebody like myself, I have the ability to kind of have this report, put it to the file, and if this project is executed again, I can kind of go back to what we previously made assumptions about, use actual project data to then kind of ground truth whether our assumptions were correct, and have all this information for the record. Prior to this tool being developed, there was no real standard for anybody, whether it be in the Corps of Engineers or at BOEM or anybody who's interested in doing these types of analyses. There was no method to do it that was standardized. Getting back to the turtle piece, the really cool part about this tool here is that when that report spits out, it shows me who the scientists were that actually collected all the data on sea turtles that I used to do my analysis. So I could actually give Kristen a call if one of her turtle data sets was used and try to gather more information about what she may know in that area. Some of the key takeaway messages is this is a support tool, not a decision tool. So again, these things are used to kind of help guide a decision, but they're not spitting out a decision specifically that you're using. You're kind of using it to inform one. It's a simple, standardized user interface, transparent, repeatable, and defensible. So transparency is the key. So as that report is produced, we can go back and see what logic was used to kind of make different risk classifications. The infrastructure supports a learning environment. So I mentioned earlier that as we kind of report out on what assumptions we made, I can then see what actually happened during a project and try to continue to improve our analyses in the future. One of the biggest gaps that was identified in developing this tool is that we really don't have the amount of turtle data that we want, specifically about sea turtle behavior and where that interaction with the dredging actually occurs. We needed to develop more of that. And so that's kind of a subtle transition into Kristen's talk, whereas we've identified gaps, we're now investing new research into try to fill those gaps to better understand behavior of turtles in our specific project areas. So the vision moving forward is that this decision support tool will now kind of serve as our umbrella, that as we gather more turtle data, it will continue to inform the tool. And so we're looking to collaborate with other scientists, whether it be USGS, NOAA, or other academics, help them understand the real need that we have to make decisions so that as they're collecting information, we can build it into this tool. Again, it's about reducing risk on all of our projects, being transparent, and ultimately having a win-win where we can conduct these operations in a way that has low risk and efficient operations, and in the long run, hopefully reduce overall project costs. So as I transition now for Kristen, just a recap, I've kind of laid out the operations that present the risk, where that risk is, the tool that we've developed at BOEM to try to manage that risk and inform our decisions, the gap that we have of specific sea turtle behavior information that we need to make the tool more robust. And with that said, I'd like to kind of transition now into Kristen's talk to help fill that gap a little bit.
I'm Kristen, and thank you for sticking around for part two. As Doug mentioned, we are doing sort of the practical application of, we're doing the empirical data collection to figure out what these turtles are doing in different places, primarily in the Gulf. And this term biologging in my title, I just wanted to describe that. It is the body of tags that we put on animals to discern behavior and movement. So the electronic tagging, so satellite tags, depth logging satellite tags, acoustic tags, anything we like glue on a turtle that can tell us what it's doing. As you'll see, it's pretty incredible what we can know, and we've been a part of that process of getting there with tool development and tag development. It's the body of things that are in your Wii or in your iPhone to know level or moving if you're pretending to play tennis or whatever with your Wii. And so those technological advancements have made their way into the actual devices that we're gluing on animals. And so we can know what they're doing and where they're going and where they're going and what they're doing in a way we've never known before. So it's pretty exciting. I have permits to do this work with sea turtles, so catching them in the water, catching them on the beach. So that's a big thing, which was why it was a logical partnership with BOEM, because they really need to partner with a scientist who has the credentials to do that kind of work. So we are out there catching turtles underwater, on the water, on the beaches, and we have permits through DOI as well as NOAA. We mark these animals for long-term sort of survival, abundance, things like that over the long term. These animals live up to 100 years. They take 25 years to mature. There's a long life cycle, and it's a complex life cycle. Mostly females are just on nesting beaches, so that's what we know the most about. But the animals that are in the water, juveniles, subadults, males, we just know a lot less about. So you really got to get in the water to figure out what these animals are doing. We sample all animals for genetics and isotopes to try to figure out where they're from, so their genetic stock of origin, as well as the isotopes, which tells us their resource use, so diet, things like that. But this biologging thing is kind of a new aspect of my own work in the last decade or so. And it's that body of tags that we can put on turtles and get back Sometimes, like satellite tags can transmit through the satellites and give us data on a daily basis, but these other tags you have to get back. So you'll see that's part of our progression of getting tags back from animals at sea that you don't often recapture is a challenge, and we're getting there. But my group and Meg Lamont, I want to mention my partner in crime up in Gainesville. We do a lot of sea turtle work with USGS. We collaborate on all aspects of this. But we seem to be, we've made ourselves leaders in the field for sea turtle telemetry and modeling and figuring this stuff out. I have a quick list here of our publications that are all available on the USGS Pubs warehouse. And then we have 2 current projects funded by BOEM. Actually, it's 3 now, but these are up on the USGS. I think it's out of Louisiana. It's a website that's hosted, and you can sort of look at GoMaps. It's a Gulf-wide sea turtle, seabird, and marine mammal distribution and abundance project. And then this other one is our new, our current project on figuring out, as Doug mentioned, these behavioral patterns of sea turtles at specific sites. And then our new one is very much about biologging. So again, this is what the thing looks like. That's in all these devices. It's just a little motherboard. They're in cameras, they're in your Wii's, they're in your iPhones. But it allows us to know things about many times per second, and in our case, 4 times a second in each of the 3 dimensions. I know what an animal is doing. So if it's flipper beating, if it's going to the surface, if it's at depth, you have this information at a scale that's been unbelievable to get into. It's also a data challenge. That's why there's so much data. In about a minute, it can fill up an Excel spreadsheet. So this is kind of the big data in my world. I'm not a microbiologist or anything dealing with genomes, but this is big data for us. And that cannot be transmitted through the satellites, unlike basic location data, which can. So these devices we often have to get back from turtles. This is an acoustic tag. That's just another sort of device that can ping. And these are, you have to put listening stations out, and then as animals pass through that, you can get a location at that station. So you can know where an animal is, but that's a much more area-specific kind of tool. But when coupled together, this is what it looks like underwater. It's about the size of 2 Coke cans stacked, and that's constantly listening for this series of tags that you can put on in sharks, on turtles, in fish, and we have arrays of those things in the world. I'm particularly involved with the one in the Virgin Islands, but we have them in the Florida Keys. There's some in the Northern Gulf looking at sturgeon. There's a lot of investment in this tool. There's some on the Atlantic coast funded by BOEM to look at fish movements. But this is what it looks like from the turtle perspective. This is a basic satellite tag, and this is an accelerometer. So that's an ADL. It looks like about 2 AA batteries in epoxy. This satellite tag has 3, and it has an antenna. This one gives me locations via email every day. This one I have to get back. And this is just a close-up of some of the tags. We have a fouling problem in the northern Gulf of Mexico. It's just a thing, even when coated with anti-fouling paint. So sometimes you don't get transmissions. It's still on an animal, but you don't get the transmission. So most of the time we get a year on these animals of locations. But when you couple them together, you know where it's going and what it's doing on a scale that we've never been able to know before. This is a small version that we put on juveniles. We also put this in pythons. It's a whole nother story. And this is what we've programmed, and we have a paper on showing movements of 11 juvenile green turtles over about a 4-day period in the dry tortugas, and we found different patterns of resting deep for larger ones and resting shallow for little ones. So that actually informs our searches of where we're going to go catch these animals for our long-term studies. But we're using multiple tracking methods and tools to really document these broad and fine scale, now, animal movement patterns. And this is just an example of our dry tortugas sea turtle map. So we get this blast of like they're going here, here, here. We've got some in the northern Gulf. We don't have any from the tortugas going to Ship Shoal, but we have a project in Alabama where a bunch went that way. And we have other investigators who've tracked turtles to this exact area. But when coupled, these methods really allow us to define behaviors, habitat use, and connectivity among populations. As Doug mentioned, the BOEM Marine Minerals Program has specific areas of interest, and this is Ship Shoal, and this is the one I want to focus on today. But this is a significant sand resource that's kind of at that sweet spot for extraction. It is also a hot spot for turtles, namely mostly Kemp's Ridleys, endangered Kemp's Ridleys, and threatened loggerheads. So Doug mentioned that boat in the middle that would relocate turtles. we actually are getting samples collected. We're getting turtles collected on those boats, and we're tagging them. Then they're dragging them off about 8 miles and dropping them. And so one of the things we're assessing is how effective is that? Do they come right back? Does it take them a week? Do they stay 8 miles away? So that's one of the basic spatial location things that we can address with some of our work. This Caminetta Headland Restoration Project is a big thing, but again, there were lots of turtles and lots of sand extracted from this very place or around this area. And so this is, again, a very important area, not only for turtles, but also for Boehm. And it continues to be, as he mentioned, a spot that they're going back to. So one of our questions is actually, why are the turtles there? And we're trying to get into that. Is it because the dredge is there, raking up the bottom, making it look better for turtles? Is it bringing in new crabs or fresh, kind of bait for them? We're not really sure why this area. It is sand. It's a shoal surrounded by mud and sort of flock, so it might just be that the benthic substrate is exactly perfect for them. But one of the things we're actually doing now is trawling in this area absent the dredge to sort of address that very control question, like why is this area an area? Is it just that it's adjacent to deeper water? What is it about this area? So we're doing that when the dredge is not there, as well as on the relocation trawl. Our current project is entitled Impacts of Resource Extraction on Sea Turtles in the Northern Gulf, and these are just some pictures of the animals we've captured basically at Ship Shoal. So there's Kemp's Ridleys and loggerheads, and one of the things I want to point out is some of these are males. I think I don't have this tail in there, but we get adult male sea turtles in this, which we know very little about, like globally. So far we have, I think there's 36 animals tagged at Ship Shoal, and we're defining what proportion of time is spent in the upper, middle, and lower water column because we have depth logging satellite tags. So these are sort of coarse bins, so 0 to 2 meters, 2 to 5, 5 to 10. So you can tell, the animal was in these depth bins for these amounts of time. So we have loggerheads is orange and Kemp's Ridleys are green here, but we have the percentage of total dives by duration. So most of the dives are 0 to 15 minutes or 15 to 30 minutes. And then as far as how deep do they go, Kemp's Ridleys are going predominantly up to about 15 meters, and loggerheads are mostly going into about 20 or 25, so a little deeper offshore. So that does start to address some of this. What's the risk? If you're going to be in a hopper dredge and you're in 20 to 40 meters, you're probably going to be getting more loggerheads. And I think it really helps to understand the depth profiles. We didn't have any of this when the oil spill happened. So this is all new information since 2011. We looked at the spatial data and said, well, how long does it take animals that are relocated to return to within 2 kilometers of capture sites? I don't know if it's 2 kilometers, but that's kind of within our best error range. And loggerhead home ranges were on average about the same distance from capture and release sites, but turtles that took up residence within 2 kilometers of their capture or release location did so on average within a day, so they are returning, and sometimes in less than a day. For Kemp's, we found something similar. Their home ranges were on average about the same distance to their release locations, and those that took up residence within 2 kilometers of capture locations did so usually within a day. And those that took up residence within 2 kilometers of the release location did so an average of almost 3 days later. So what we're looking at is site fidelity in that area. So we're quantifying the proportion of time they're actually spending in these little areas to say, again, what is the risk in this zone that's permitted for hopper dredging. We don't have winter information. That is a data gap because it is difficult to be working in that environment when the winds are, when you have 4 to 5 foot seas and things like that. So that is a data gap going forward. But we have had really good tracking from, I would say, April through December. So we're doing our best with what we have been given. And then we're quantifying this information just to say, well, where are these animals spending time? So the mean centroid depth, so this is just a measure of the central tendency of where they're spending their time, looks like this. This is Louisiana for Kemp's Ridleys, and this is what loggerheads look like. We did another project off Pensacola. And so we can inform just what's the depth, the average depth that they're in. We also then have the distance to shore, just to report on where these animals are spending time. So really sort of defining the environment that the animals are spending their time in. And then we intersect these and say, well, where do both species occur? If you want to avoid both of them, there's probably a sweet spot. If you want to, this one's more endangered, so maybe you're going to go off the shoal a little more, depending on the project. The other thing we're getting from these depth logging satellite tags is proportion of time at the surface. And this is a critical link to that one project I mentioned, GOMAPS, the aerial surveys being flown by NOAA, have a key piece missing. They need to know the time that animals are available to them at the surface. So it's an aerial correction factor for aerial surveys. We have it. We actually have 101 tags that I can't believe. This is 50 of them right now, but we have the Central Gulf, the Eastern Gulf, and Central Gulf planning area, and then the Western Gulf of Mexico planning area. We don't have as much off Texas as we have off the Central Gulf and off Florida. But you can start to see that the time at the surface is variable by region as well as by species. This is loggerheads and this is Kemp's Ridleys. So we'll have that for about 100 animals in another 2 weeks. So this BOEM information need, like we're fitting into what, we're delivering information into this sort of course map of like where they're spending time at the surface, at 100 meters or even deeper. But the dive profile is really that money shot. That's what they want. They want to know dive profile. So I explained to Doug this morning, I was trying to put this in like basic terms. Like if I went to the beach and I did a few dives to the bottom and, snorkeled around, you would see that like I had one deep dive and then a couple hours at the surface if I was bobbing around. But I can't construct a dive profile, which is I flipper beaded my hands, 100 times. I kicked my feet 4,000 times, and I spent 800 minutes, on the beach total or whatever. That's what I'm getting from this next generation of tags with the accelerometers. So that's where we're going. I just wanted to mention we were out in the field last week, so we got another 16 turtles tagged at Ship Shoal, and this is absent the dredge. So we really are starting to understand their behavior when the dredge is not present. So we're watching these turtles. This is just a smattering of them. This is Ship Shoal. So these are animals that we now have with no dredge present versus the dredge present in all the previous tracking. So this new project is constructing fine-scale dive profiles and activity patterns of turtles, again, at Ship Shoal, but we have a little bit of work to do. Doug had a picture on his top left that showed our pop-off accelerometer package. I need the accelerometer to come back to me because it can't transmit the amount of data through the satellites. It has to be back in my hand to physically connect to it. So we're basically working with some of the shark researchers to get this accelerometer package that's a float. It's got an accelerometer in it with either a satellite tag or a radio tag, and that pops off the turtle. And I have some pictures of that. But this is what it allows you to construct. So you can tell an animal is at the surface, then it's gliding, and then it's got an active bottom phase. And I'll show you a movie that shows this a little more clearer. Then if they're on the bottom, they're active, and then they're coming up, and they're then at the surface. And I'll show you what this looks like. But this is the kind of data BOEM needs at those spots where they're dredging, when they're dredging. This is what the base plate looks like. We 3D print this base plate and glue it to a turtle. I'm allowed by permit to glue 3 things to a turtle. So this is one of them that has those 2 tags in it. I also can put a satellite tag on this individual that would stay on it, as well as an acoustic tag. This is our first prototype that we did out in the Tortugas this past summer, and this popped off after about 3 days, and we got it back. So this was lovely conditions, perfect kind of July or August day. When we retrieved it. And this is what the raw data looks like. It's a little messy. Acceleration, it comes to us in these 3 channels. This is a loggerhead, but you can tell this animal spent some time at depth. And when we actually process this into something meaningful, we see that the animal spent a fair bit of time at depth. Its body pitch was fairly consistent, and it had a lot of flipper beating. Then it rested, and then it flipper beated and came up. And this is the time scale you're looking at. This is some raw data for a green turtle. Again, there's some movement at depth, and then all this acceleration data that we process. And this is a little movie showing you its flipper beating. This is this time period right now. It's about not more than, I think it's 10 seconds of real time. But this is what this looks like, and this is why it's actually a lot of data. But my colleague made this little movie with me to sort of get the point across that you can tell if an animal is resting or active. This is a big deal. And then this little movie shows the animal going down. So you can see the top is depth. This is body pitch, so the pitch is moving down like this. So it's not flat. It's going to start flipper beating, then it sort of gets to the bottom and hovers, and then it's going to start an active bottom time there, so it might be foraging. These are the patterns in the data that we're going to be looking at for pop-off accelerometers. So we can know if they're feeding at these sites, are they resting, are they avoiding a dredge, perhaps. And then here's what the ascent movie looks like. So again, the flipper beats, not too much. That's this channel. The body pitch, you can see it starts to rise. And then the depth obviously goes up to the surface. The turtle's still swimming. I can't speed him up, sorry. But that's, what is that, 2 minutes of real time? So one of the other things we can get with this is capture stress. You can tell when animals are handled and then they're released. You can get like how freaked out they are, or you can, there's so many ways we can use this data. I am very excited. But we can also basically collapse this down to like active nighttime or daytime periods, active versus resting periods, and you can look at body pitch. If we get mating, you would see axis flipping. So you would see, that's what I've seen in pythons. It's pretty exciting. Something's going on there. And so this is just a green turtle. And then we can also, when you think about that Ship Shoal location, it's a sandy shoal, and then there's deeper water. You can look at the transitions from shallower to deeper habitat. So you've got depth, what we call overall dynamic body acceleration. So that's when something's really, really active. And then the amplitude of that, so sort of how active they are. So there's a whole series of graphs we look at, but you can look at a series of dives, and this one's color-coded. But it's just the percent of time at the surface or in these various depth bins. So this is 0 to 15 meters, I think. And this is, time of day that we recorded it for. So again, this is what, maybe there's something that happens at night. Maybe there's something that happens in the day that can be avoided. That, again, gets at that risk entrainment. Most of the surfacing events are short that we've recorded, but represent little of the time that the individuals are shallow. And then I want to mention, we know a lot of what we're doing with this tool because we've spent a lot of time on nesting beaches, deploying this on animals we know we're going to get back, so adult females that come back every 2 weeks to nest. And I have met her back on the beach and popped off the tag, or I've had colleagues out there. And I've recorded second-by-second notes sync with time.gov to be like, she's walking up the beach, she's dropping eggs, she's covering, all that. And in 2011 and 12, we actually deployed tags, accelerometers on loggerheads in 3 locations simultaneously. So we were in the Tortugas and here in Northwest Florida and Alabama because of the oil spill. And we took a chance and put these tags out because we really wanted to find out if they were feeding during the event, during the oil spill. And so we found that they're actually quite active here. And in the Tortugas, they're basically just sitting, they're nesting and then they're resting. So they have no outside influence in the Tortugas, really. They don't false crawl more often. They don't swim away more often. In the Northern Gulf, there's a lot more threats. There's a lot more boat traffic. There's a lot more lighting. And so it might be that we actually have captured something here about turtles being affected by humans. So we're getting a lot more into this. We basically did this to really get that pattern of a nesting event logged in the data. And so this is a loggerhead, again, depth, body pitch, and flipper beating. And I'm just going to walk you through. This is the turtle crawling up the beach, excavating the egg chamber, and they're on the beach for a little over an hour. This is egg deposition, covering the eggs and flinging sand to mask the nest, and then returning to the ocean. So we've logged that for over 50 turtles. I think we counted 60 this morning. We can discern false crawls from this as well. So we can look at successful nesting events versus times that they're just either, you call it emerge no lay, or false crawls. They come up for some reason, they leave the beach, they dig, maybe they hit something, maybe their contractions aren't as strong as they thought they were, whatever it is. But we can actually look at this in the data and say, this is a green turtle that actually came up and dug like 6 or 8 times that night, and then the next night she came back and nested, but the condition of the beach may have something to do with this. It may be that that's just her pattern. So I think we're getting a much better sense of what these animals are doing, how they're using beaches. It might very well relate to how constructed beaches are being used by these animals. So is it the right compaction? It's a whole world of what we could talk to about with the Army Corps to get into beach building and are animals using it? Is it appropriate for them beyond sand grain size and compaction factors? So we've actually done this for 60 turtles. Donna Shaver put a bunch out on Kemp's Ridleys. We put a bunch out on loggerheads, hawksbills, and greens. And we have this paper ready to go because we want to share this with the world. We want people to look at this pattern in their data and then interpret it. And there is a new class of tags coming out where you can tell, it's called a scout tag. You can say, this is the pattern I want to know. Just tell me when this event occurred. So like you put it on 100 turtles and you'll get the report of how many times they nested. So we're getting there with a lot of information. You could look at specific dives if you wanted to know the deepest dives, and that tag could just look for that. We're getting really specific with the questions we can ask with these tags that are affixed to these animals. This was just a quick walkthrough. So we're collecting fine-scale accelerometer data for multiple species across long time periods, and you can see it in our data. Kemps nest during the day. These animals nest mostly at night, but we've had some up to 40 days in duration. The limit is battery life right now. A false crawl is this greenish triangle, nesting is a purple, and the tag died at the end here. So some of these have been limited because you're asking so much of the tag. It's collecting 4 times a second in each of the 3 dimensions. Like, it's an extraordinary amount of data. And so we've used some of the initial ones to then sort of sample at a lower frequency, but we're still getting the same patterns. And so this is pretty incredible effort from a bunch of people. But some of these are also getting the company to try to figure out how to get 80 days out of them instead of 40. Then we had a few surprises. We have gotten about 60 to 65% of the ones back that we ever put out, and some of them come back 2 years later, 3 years later, because that's the nesting cycle of an individual. This turtle we tagged, and she nested the next night in the Tortugas, which is my little study site out here, and she took off for the Bahamas. So this is the distance. She's moving away from the study site, and this is the same color as here. So she left, got in the Florida Straits, she cooked along to the Bahamas, and then she got up on the shelf, and then she went here. There's some error in here. I don't know if she wandered a little. And then she selected this foraging area where she stayed for 2 years, 2.5 years, before coming back to the Tortugas with her tag, and I got it back then. Sent it to the company, and they gave me all this data, and we figured it out, and we were like, I cannot believe we got this. So this animal also had a satellite tag on her, so we know exactly where she was going and what she was doing at a scale that has never been observed. This is the depth information that she was using on her migratory path. And this is her overall dynamic body acceleration. And so you can see she's not doing too much. And then when she gets to the foraging area, which is around this kind of greenish color, there's a distinct phase shift here. So this, even though I can't observe the animal foraging, this might be very useful for us to put these tags on animals and then figure out if they are foraging. This very well might be what a foraging turtle looks like. And there are very few observations of animals at foraging areas or not foraging. You could look at body change dynamics, like are Kemps ridleys foraging in the Gulf after the oil spill? Well, let's stick these devices on them and figure that out, because you won't have direct observations of foraging in the Northern Gulf on the bottom. It could very well tie in with the risk of hopper dredging and all this kind of stuff. I think that's it. I have way more to say, but I won't. Thank you, and yeah, we'll stop there.